master candidates this year, Bill Stacy and Mike Funk. And according to the rules of the Santa Rosa Photographic Society, the master candidate gives a presentation to the membership, 45-minute presentation. And the objective of the presentation is to not only educate the fellow members, but also to exhibit the mastery or the competence in one photographic area of the choosing of the candidate. So Mike has chosen to talk about bird photography, and did you expand it to wildlife too, Mike? Or?
Well, I included wildlife. Mostly it's birds, but there are other wildlife included in it because a lot of the rules apply whether it's a bear or a bird, really.
Okay. So a 45-minute presentation, and Mike, how would you like to do it? You want to do all 45 at once, or you want to take a break at some point?
Yeah, we'll just see how it goes time-wise. I think I've got more than enough to last 45 minutes. And then hopefully if there's questions, we can get into that after. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, and if you
Sounds
want to
good.
go over 45, feel free.
Right.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of material here, so I'm sure it'll last 45.
Well, we'll turn it over to you, Mike.
All right, before I try and figure out how to share my screen, I'm sure Bill's going to have to help me with that one. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to do this. I've learned a lot since joining the club. And when I was trying to figure out what to do this presentation on, it was kind of difficult because I like quite a few aspects of photography. I like street photography. I like landscape photography. I like doing portraits, black and white photography. Just a pretty wide variety of things that I enjoy doing in photography. So I started thinking, what do I really enjoy doing and getting out and having fun? And it was wildlife / bird photography, primarily birds, for a variety of reasons. And I'll get into that in a couple minutes. But I thought I'd give you a little background on me and photography. I think I try to look back and determine when I started learning or doing anything with photography. And it was when I was in the Air Force. I was stationed in Taiwan. I lived there for a year and a half. I believe it was 1970, 71. And while I was there, I bought a Pentax camera, a film camera. And I'd walk all over the city of Taichung and take photographs. And it was a target-rich environment, as you might imagine, going through the markets and seeing chickens and all sorts of food hanging on racks out in the open. It was quite an experience living over there. So I got into photography that way. And I didn't send my film out to be developed. I did it myself in the darkroom. I was certainly no Ansel Adams when it came to darkroom work, but it was a lot of fun. There's a couple of other fellows that were there that helped me get through that, but I really enjoyed it. And I had a whole bunch of photographs that I had taken back then, and I'd stuck them under a bed, and they'd been there for 20, 30, 40 years. So I went looking for them recently. I couldn't find them. So who knows? You know, we've moved a few times since those days, and so I have no idea what happened to them. So after that, I continued liking photography. I did it on and off, mostly just family events. I got into radio-controlled aircraft, mostly helicopters, and I did airplanes also. At one time, I had 9 airplanes and 5 helicopters. And Nancy was pretty lenient with me, spending a fair amount of money hanging and keeping my own hangar in the garage, so to speak. And I'd go out and I'd photograph the guys flying their planes and then trying to do what I can to make them really look cool. And I enjoyed that. And then moving on to, I think it was 2016, I decided to get Lightroom. And that's when I started really thinking about photography in a way that I had not before. And it's been quite a learning experience going on. And obviously the club has taught me a lot. YouTube has taught me quite a bit also. Anybody that's friends with me on Facebook knows that one of my favorite things to photograph is my grandkids. I do birds, wildlife, street photography, and I enjoy doing architecture also. One of the things that really I enjoy most is getting out and just walking around taking pictures. During the pandemic was no difference. I'd walk around the neighborhoods, I'd walk downtown wherever I could, and I'd find something to photograph. I even did a series on fire hydrants. So it's kind of kept me going, and it was a lot of fun. But birds were, I guess, my primary focus, because there was a couple of good parks here in Petaluma that I could walk around, Ellis Creek and Schollenberger Park. And I could get a couple of miles in really easy. Of course, my wife would say, you're stopping all the time to take pictures, so you're really not getting that much exercise. But I did it, and it was fun. And I started to see some improvement over the years. And I even saw improvement once I decided that I was going to do this presentation a number of months ago. I started really concentrating on what I was trying to accomplish. And as I look back on my photographs over the last 5 years or so, I have seen an improvement, and I think it's because of practice, and I'll talk a little bit about that also. One of the comments that I received from the committee that took a look at my outline was that I might want to show a slideshow. Well, I hope that you're not too bored by the time you get done with this, because you're going to see plenty of photographs. One of the hardest parts of tonight's presentation for me was to select photographs that were appropriate to try and get across the point that I was trying to make with whatever topic I was going to be including here. So of the thousands and thousands of bird and wildlife photos I have, I tried to pick those that got the point across what I was trying to get to. And you'll see that. Not always my best photos, but photos that I think will tell a story. So a disclaimer right here. I'm not a birder. I'm not an expert in birds by any means, but I really enjoy photographing them. Mm-hmm. And it's just, it's something that has grown on me. And I'll show you some photos pretty soon that will show you where I started, and hopefully you'll see as we progress, hopefully you'll see I've made some improvements. So now, if I can figure out how to share my screen here, do you have to let me do that, Bill? Or do I just hit share screen? I've done it.
Yeah, put the cursor down where you see the share screen.
All right. Got it?
Click on it, and you're ready to go. And then pick.
Right. Yeah, that's not what I want. Let's see.
And then pick the window that you want to share.
Boom, boom, boom. Desktop. All right, share. And then I have to find my, that's not it.
Should open the program that you're running your slides from.
All right, let me back out of this and then do that first, I guess, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, so that you already have it up.
We're getting quite the tour.
Yeah, here I am. All right. Did I find it? I think I got it.
You did it.
All right, now if I can figure out how to hit the play button here. Got to get rid of you there, Bill. All right, play. Okay. Wildlife and bird photography by me. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Looks great.
All right. My journey into wildlife and bird photography. Wildlife and bird photography aren't really mutually exclusive. Many of the same principles apply. So whether you're taking a picture of a bird or a bear or pretty much anything else, you know, lighting and all the different aspects of photography that we all pay attention to come into play here. The photo on the right was taken at Ellis Creek. It was just a portrait of a great blue heron. The one on the left, the bear, was a surprise shot as I was driving into Glacier National Park. And all of a sudden the car stopped ahead of me, and here's this bear, and I'm trying to get my camera out from under the seat. There were other people in the car. So I took that shot through the windshield, just a last second thing. So you never know when you're going to come up on something. So it's important that you be ready. All sorts of places and things you can take photographs of. Out at Jenner, the seal and the seagulls, the eagle and the seal on the beach, and of course the bears. And I'll talk a little bit about bears a little bit later on. But these are just things that have kind of piqued my interest. All right, I think when I look back on it, this was the shot that got me started. I was in Petaluma. We have a marina by the Sheraton Hotel. And there's a spit of land that goes out into the river. And I was at the end of this spit, actually going to take a landscape photo looking down the river, and I saw this great blue heron. And I started watching him, and I had a 100 to 400 millimeter lens on, and he started doing his fishing, and I caught this image. And it really got me excited. Not that it's such a great image, because all the bushes and things that are in the way, but this got me, I said, wow, this could be a lot of fun. I think there's action to be had here, and I've always tried to capture that if I could. So why do wildlife photography? It's fun. It really is fun. And it's not easy. Anybody can take a picture of something that's just standing still, but to do it and try and get it right is a little challenging. And it also gets you out in nature, gets you walking around. The way I like to do it, and there's different types of photographers, wildlife, I'm the walking around kind of guy. I like to get some exercise, walk around with my camera and grab what I can when I see it. Others will go out and spend hours sitting waiting for a particular bird or animal. I just haven't had that kind of patience to do it. But it is another way to get out there and get some great photographs. So this was out at Doran Beach early in the morning. And one of my favorite bird photographers, a guy by the name of Mark Smith, who's based down in Florida. I don't know if anybody's seen any of his videos, but he does an amazing job. I read his book, and he claims, and I happen to agree, that 25% of bird photography is timing, 25% is the photographer, 25% is your gear, and 25% is luck. Timing, you have to be in the right place at the right time, obviously. Also, if the bird or whatever it is you're photographing is going to do some sort of behavior, for instance, dart their head down into the water to catch a fish, bring up a fish, or if it's a bear catching a salmon in a river, those types of things don't happen all the time. So you have to have a certain amount of luck and timing to be there at the right time. 25% photographer, it takes practice to do this. I found, and I know there are others that have gone out and walked around or sat down at a lake and tried to take photographs, but it takes practice. And eventually, with perseverance, you will get better. Now, gear, camera gear, this is an interesting one because I think we've all heard over the years that gear really doesn't matter. And in some aspects of photography, I think that's absolutely true. It really doesn't matter. But in wildlife photography, I truly believe gear does matter. And I found that out personally in the last year, how much it matters. So I'll talk a little bit about that later when I get to gear. But having the right gear is extremely important. Some of the things that you can capture, that being in the right place at the right time, is simple shots like this. Is this juvenile bald eagle eating a fish, a swan flying by. And I don't know if you've ever seen a swan fly by, be relatively close to it. It's really quite a unique experience. They're very loud. The wings, you can hear them coming. It doesn't happen all the time. And I've had a lot of luck with swans. And this was just one photograph that I happened to pick because he was flying right in front of me and I was able to catch it. And then these avocets about to do some mating here. So being in the right place, the right time, you have to have a certain amount of luck to do this, but you also have to have the gear that allows you to get these kind of photographs. Now, here's a series that I think really does show luck, gear, and all of the above. This is a pair of tree swallows at Ellis Creek about a month ago. And on the top left, you'll see that the swallow's coming in to meet his mate. And then the next one on the right, he's just about to land on her. And then the bottom left, they start to get into it. And in the lower right, he gives her a kiss goodbye and then he thank you very much. But it's not something I'd seen before, and I really didn't know what I had until I got home and put it on the computer, because these guys are pretty small. And you really have to use a fast shutter speed to try and catch them like this, because they're very fast. Okay, foundations and fundamentals. I think most of us know this, maybe don't think about it as much as we could or should, but these are some of the things that I'm going to talk about. And the first one is light. And light is really important when it comes to photographing birds. Now, you can take a bird photo any time of the day, but I would say the best times is early in the morning when the light is really good, and later in the afternoon or early evening, again, when the light is good. So light is extremely important when it comes to bird photography. Now, this is an example of front light with the light shining directly on the front of the bird. This was out at Tole Lake Regional Park. This was backlight, and this was an egret flying across the sun early one morning on the way to on the way to Schollenberger Park. There's a path from the Sheraton Hotel in Petaluma, and I used to like to walk that early in the morning. And then this one here was an eagle that I took up in Washington about a month ago at sunrise. And I don't get too many of these flying right in front of the sun like this. It was quite an experience and a lot of fun, but lighting really makes the silhouette pop. You also have side light. If you can take a look at this hawk, this was taken at Schollenberger Park, and you can see that his left side is lit and his other side is in shadow a bit. And it makes for a very pleasing photograph. So the lighting is extremely important, again, whether it's front, side, back, and then diffused light like this. This was taken at Howarth Park, these woodpeckers out there. And so the lighting is very even, and it makes a pleasing photograph. All right, sharpness of the image. Focus, shutter speed, squeeze the shutter, use continuous focus, and your ISO. Now, this particular photo I took, I was walking across a parking lot in a shopping center, and these pigeons came flying by. and I had a 70 to 200 on just as a walk around. And you can see with a slow shutter speed like 1/640th of a second that their wings are blurred, really gives you a sense of motion. So speed will be something I'll talk about a number of times here. So shutter speed is extremely important. The higher you can get it, the better generally, unless you're going for a photograph like this where you want to show motion in the wings. You have to use continuous focus. I don't know what it's called on Nikon or other ones. I'm a Canon shooter, and it's servo mode. So continuous focus to try and keep the birds in focus as you move along, or as they move along. And the ISO is real important because you have to push yourself to get used to using a higher ISO if you're going to get to faster shutter speeds. Now here's an egret out at Bodega Bay, and I shot it at 1/2000th of a second. And I was able to stop the action as he was wrestling this fish for breakfast.
Wow.
So you really have to punch up the shutter speed. Now the ISO is relatively low because it was a very bright morning. Now this is the same guy, but at 1/3200th, and I was able to catch his breakfast in midair. And you might not have been able to do that if you had a slower shutter speed. And then the last in the series, another fast shutter speed, 1/3200. This was an interesting time. This egret caught this fish right in front of me. He was probably 40 feet away. And he just started walking right to me with the fish in its mouth, and he was throwing it up, playing with it. And he must have got within 15 feet. He didn't care. He knew he was being photographed, I guess, and liked it. So it was quite a good experience. It was not something that I've experienced before where the bird just didn't seem to care if anybody was around. Of course, he was waiting for breakfast too, I suppose. This is one of my favorite egret photos. I took this at Ellis Creek, and I'll give another example of the lighting and how I got this photograph in just a minute. But this is a slower shutter speed, but it's a large bird, and these egrets aren't very fast. And it's a lot easier to catch them at a slow shutter speed. Of course, you have to practice your panning techniques to try and match the bird with the camera, basically. One way I did that, practicing, if I didn't feel like going out to Ellis Creek or anywhere else to shoot birds, I'd go to a dog park. If you ever been to a dog park, some of these dogs are pretty darn fast. And I didn't put any photos in here, but it's a great place to practice panning techniques. So you can pan with the dog, and it will also get you to start thinking when you're panning for birds, you have to try and keep them focused. Now, you don't always have to use a fast shutter speed. Here's a bird I took at 3.2 seconds, which is pretty unheard of. But fortunately, I was on a tripod early one morning at the Petaluma River, and I saw this night heron down on these piers. So you can get a bird photo at 3.2 seconds, which is pretty unusual. Obviously, he was just standing there staring into the early morning, so I was lucky. Another shot which shows the stopping the wings at 1/2000th of a second, but the ISO is a little bit higher. It's 1250. And fortunately, we have software that we can get rid of noise, and I'll talk about that later. But just keep pushing the speed up, and you can come up with some interesting photos. So here's one at 1/1250. And it's ISO 6400, which is starting to get pretty high, but you can catch some unique images here. Another one, a little bit slower, 1/800th. I just have to wonder what would happen if I had it at 1/32nd, 1/3200th of a second. Now here's a a bird taken off from Ellis Creek, and the fast shutter speed really does help. You can see it freezes his wings, freezes the water as he pushes off to get himself going in flight. And here he is as he went by me, and you can see it's pretty darn sharp, and the shutter speed is 1/2500th of a second. Now, I'll talk a little bit about ISO and auto ISO in a moment, but I like to be able to photograph in changing situations, and auto ISO is something that I use almost exclusively. Not always, but most of the time. Now, here's an example of a missed opportunity where I had the shutter speed way too low. When I was up in Washington not long ago, I was photographing eagles, and I had taken a number of shots of this particular juvenile as he flew by, and you'll see one of them later on. And I was a real high shutter speed at the time, but he flew into this tree, and it was early morning, and it was pretty dark. So I dropped the speed on the camera down to 1/320th. And I was getting some pretty good portraits, but then all of a sudden he decided to leap, and my shutter speed just didn't cut it. Now you can see as he just started to leap, I was somewhat in focus, but then he kept on going, and I missed what I think probably would have been a really good shot here because I hadn't kept the speed up. So shutter speed is really important. All right, point of view. This is really important when it comes to photographing, especially birds. You want to try and be at their level. This little night heron was behind a pier in downtown Petaluma by the turning basin. And I used to go down there early in the morning. There was a time you could walk along the floating dock. They've since locked that off to boat owners now that it's been dredged down there. But you could find all kinds of wildlife there. You didn't have to go to the parks. You could go right downtown, and there was all sorts of birds there. Point of view, again, not really something that I like to do, but I thought this was a pretty good shot because he's just looking right at me like, what are you doing? And it was kind of interesting. So it was different. But generally, I try and be at the eye level with whatever animal I'm shooting. So these seals are out at Jenner, out at the beach there, if you've been out there, where the Russian River comes and meets the ocean. And I was lying on my stomach across the way from where these, across the river from where these seals were, trying to get down low as best I could to get a shot at their faces. And as you can see, I think it turned out okay. Now this guy, and obviously I cropped this a bit, but here's really what you try and go for. You want to try and get down to the bird's eye level if you can. And here this bird was coming, walking down a path. I happened to be on a lower level. It was at Schollenberger Park where there's one area there where the path is up high, and there's that's the paved path, and then there's one down lower, and I was able to get this shot right at his body level. You want to try and shoot right at their eye level. Here's another one, a red-winged blackbird looking right at me. I think it gives a much more intimate view of the bird when you are at this level. If you were to shoot it up high or even down low, I don't think it would have the same impact. A raven or a crow. This was up at McCarricker State Beach up outside of Fort Bragg. And this is a willet out at Dorn Park. And again, I was lying on the beach to get these photographs. And it just puts you more in their place rather than standing up high and shooting down on them. Here's another one. This is at Ellis Creek of northern pintails. And while I wasn't quite as low as I could have been, that Ellis is kind of difficult because the ponds are often lower than where you can shoot from. So you're at a higher level looking down at them. Now you can offset that by the angle that you're shooting at. So if they're further away from you, you can the, the the shallower angle will give you this type of photo rather than if you were close shooting down at them. So you can still make it work. Now this one, I don't think it would have worked if I was down at their level. This duck at Lucchese Park here in town, I wouldn't be able to see all the little geese, goslings, ducklings, I guess ducklings they are. So I think it makes a good photograph, but I wasn't down low, I was up high, and there's reflections. One thing I've really tried to concentrate on lately is the background. Now, here's a decent photo of a couple of geese, Canada geese, but it's pretty boring, really. I mean, it's just a blue sky with a couple of geese that are, you know, in focus, but there's nothing really exciting about the photograph. So background is something that you really should consider and think about as you're trying to shoot birds. So here's another Canada geese early in the morning, but you can see he's not just up in the sky, he's flying down low. He's lit by the early morning sun. And it just makes, I think, for a much more pleasing photograph. And he's, you know, quacking away there as they tend to do. You can hear him coming a mile away. Now, this seagull, if I had just shot him and he was up in the blue sky, I don't think I would have even noticed that he had his head cranked around like that. And nor would I probably have seen all the water droplets that are around his head and wings. And again, this one was shot at a very high shutter speed, 1/3200th of a second. And the ISO wasn't too bad, 1250. And most of our cameras now, the newer ones will be able to handle a higher ISO than what you might think. Again, some more background photos with birds. It puts them in the environment. The red-winged blackbird against some yellow mustard grass is certainly a much more pleasing photo than if he was just on a brown branch somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. And the same with the other, the bluebird, and I'm not sure if it's a phoebe or what, but on the pine cones. And that was in Petaluma also. I like to get photographs that show where I am and show the environment around where you are. So here comes a swan coming in for a landing at one of the ponds out there. And you can see I'm in a park, there's somebody walking down a path, and it just gives you a sense of place. And so if I can capture a moment like this, I really enjoy doing that, and I think it makes for an excellent photograph. Again, here's another one where you can take a million pictures of seagulls if they're flying by in the air, but this one puts, you know where he is. He's out at the ocean here, and it puts him in his environment. So I think background plays an extremely important role in photography of birds. Exposure is really important, obviously. I think we all try and get our exposure correct in camera. White birds and dark birds can be very difficult. You have to try and make sure that they aren't over or underexposed. You try and get them just right. And if you do it right, they create a mood and determines how the viewer will feel about the image. If you can't get it right in camera, just concentrate on the lighting, the sharpness, and the point of view in the background. Now, this particular white-tailed kite was hovering. If you've ever seen white-tailed kites hunt, they are a lot of fun to watch. They just will hover in midair, flapping their wings, looking down to try and find a vole or some sort of snack for themselves. It's quite a sight to behold. And so here I was able to capture them pretty well, but it was a really early, well, it wasn't really early. It was later in the morning and the sky was kind of blown out. But he's in focus and the exposure on the bird is actually quite good, I think. Composition. You know, as with any other type of photography, composition plays a role in bird photography also. It's not always easy to get the composition that you want, but if a bird is standing still, like this particular eagle, you can actually make your composition in camera without too much trouble and not have to crop a whole lot. I chose to make this a pano type, but he was in the right place. I didn't have to do too much work to do that. This was at the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge, up outside of Willows. The rule of thirds, where you place the bird in the photograph. We all know the rule of thirds. Try to keep them out of the center unless it's that type of a photograph where it would lend itself. But in this one, I felt that the bird should have been on the left, and I tried to leave enough room on the right where he was looking. And that's a mistake that I often see, especially newer photographers make, in that they will crowd the bird in the direction it's looking. And it's not as nearly as pleasing as leaving plenty of room to look where the bird is looking. Diagonal lines. Here's a few snowy egrets. This was out at Bodega Bay also. And you can see they're lined up, and I think it makes a pleasing composition. Plus, it's kind of fun to see these three guys sitting out there on this rock. Here's another diagonal line. This was up at Howarth Park, and it just more pleasing than showing him horizontal, I think. It just seems to work for me, and I hope it does for you too. But diagonal lines in composition is important. All right, we'll get into equipment here. You know, people say, oh, you got to spend a lot of money, you got to have a huge lens to do wildlife photography. Well, it helps, it certainly does, but you really don't have to. You can take pictures just like this with a 24-105 or any sort of travel lens. I have some examples of photos I took recently with a 50mm. So you can get nice, pleasing wildlife photos with a standard lens. You don't need to spend big money. You may not get the good close-ups that others get, but you can get some nice wildlife photos. I mean, this is wildlife. You see all the birds in the tree, and then you see the egret below one of my favorite trees at Ellis Creek. Now, I recently bought a nifty 50. If you're a Canon shooter, you know what a nifty 50 is. It's a very inexpensive 50mm lens. They came out with a new one for the new mirrorless cameras, and I had just gotten it, so I took it for a walk. And while geese and ducks aren't going to fly away from you like many other birds, you can still capture some nice wildlife photos using a standard lens. You don't have to have the big 600mm to get a decent wildlife or bird photo. Okay, cameras. Here I'll get into mirrorless and DSLRs. And now that I've had both, I've had some experience with them, and we all have our own opinions, and I'll give you mine, I guess. All right, mirrorless. One of the things I love about my mirrorless cameras, and I started, my first mirrorless was a Canon EOS R. And I sold that to one of our club members who takes absolutely gorgeous photos with it. It's a great camera, but it really didn't work for wildlife and birds because the frame rate wasn't fast enough. You just couldn't get it to focus in continuous focus mode. So I upgraded recently to a Canon R5. But the live exposure in the viewfinder, I just love because I don't miss exposure anymore. When I had a DSLR, I put it up to my eye and I'd take the photograph and then I'd look at it and I'd say, wow, did I underexpose or overexposed? It was just a very difficult lesson. But with mirrorless, what you see is what you get. They also have silent shooting when you use the high frame rates, at least on mine, my Canon it does. It'll shoot 20 frames a second, but I think the new Sonys and new Canon coming out, they're going to shoot 30 frames a second. And there are benefits to having the high frame rate. I can give you a couple examples. And one of the easiest one to explain is I often shoot my grandson's junior varsity baseball games. And if I have it in regular burst mode, it'll shoot 12 frames a second. But if I put it in electronic shutter, it'll do 20. And the best way for me to explain it, and I don't have a photo, unfortunately, to show you, is if the pitcher is throwing to first base and trying to get a guy that was trying to steal second, you can see the ball in the image once, maybe twice at a slower frame rate. But if you put it at 20 frames per second, you'll get at least 4, maybe even 5 shots with the ball heading to the first baseman's gloves. So you really have a much wider range of options for you to choose from. When it comes to birds, another example would be a couple of days ago, Tony and I were up in Oregon, and there was an egret that was sitting on a dock right at the corner. And he kept bending down to the water, and I had it in regular shutter mode, which was 12 frames a second. And I got him dunking his head into the water and grabbing a fish. Well, he was there for a while, so I put it on electronic shutter, 20 frames a second, and he did it again. But this time, I got every single motion of him putting his head in the water. I must have 3 or 4 frames just of the water shooting out from his head as he plunged it down in, and then pulling it up again, another 5 or 10 frames. So you just have a much wider range of photos that you can choose from. It has in-body image stabilization, which is really nice. I haven't had that before on my previous cameras. And an eye detect autofocus. If you haven't used this, if you don't have a camera that has it, this is one area where gear really does matter. It makes your ability to capture birds in flight, for instance, so much easier than it used to. So I'll have a demonstration here in just a moment of how it works. They're lighter and they're smaller. A lot easier to lug around with you. Now, the DSLR, one thing I missed initially was the optical viewfinder, because when I put it to my eye, I could see immediately what I was looking at. Where with the mirrorless, I had about a half a second lag, and I had to make sure I prepared to take the photograph and kept my finger on the shutter button halfway so it was active when I got it to my eye. So one of the benefits of the DSLR was the optical viewfinder. Although it was also a negative because it didn't tell you what your exposure was. The higher end, more expensive DSLRs, you can get some pretty high frame rates with those, like the 1DX series. I think they're 20 or 30 frames a second. They're built like a tank. I know my 5D Mark IV is built like a tank. And they're fast autofocus also, and there's no delay in the optical viewfinder like there is with the mirrorless. Full frame or crop sensor, and I know Bill is going to be doing a program on this, so I won't get too deep into it. But a full frame, you just don't get the reach like you do with a crop sensor. The crop sensor will bring you closer to whatever your target is. If it's a bird, you'll be a lot closer. And I have a photograph coming up that'll show that pretty clearly. The sensor size, the full frame, is equivalent to a 35 millimeter frame, film. And the crop is smaller. I have found through my personal experience that megapixels matter. If you're just taking a landscape photo, you don't need a ton of megapixels. But if you're trying to shoot birds and some of them are at a distance, you're going to have to crop the photo. And I think most wildlife photographers, especially if they're shooting birds, will crop their photo. And if you have a larger megapixel density, such as 45 or 61, you'll be able to crop in substantially without losing too much definition in the photo. So a crop sensor Canon, I had a 80D at one time. A 400 millimeter lens on that was equal to 640 millimeters. But on a full frame, 400 is 400 millimeters. So there is obviously a difference. So here's an example. The crop sensor got me a lot closer than the full frame at the bottom. Now, the way I got this photograph was, this was out at Bodega Head, and my camera has the ability to switch modes. So I moved it from full frame to crop sensor, which is 1.6 crop, which will get you closer. And so here's an example of the difference. I prefer personally shooting in full frame mode all the time now that I have a 45 megapixel camera. It really does make a difference. Okay, I don't know if anybody knows this fellow. I think he lives around here somewhere. Lenses for wildlife, prime versus zoom. As you can see, a prime lens, they are often, I'm going to get my note here, they're oftentimes very expensive. They're oftentimes big and heavy. And they can be extremely expensive. Like that lens he's shooting there, it's probably a $13,000 lens if you were to buy it new. If it's a Canon 600 millimeter f4, they run $13,000. You can obviously find them used for less, but you're talking some heavy duty cash when you're looking to do that. And there are some negatives with a big prime like that also. Now the camera that's, the lens that's hanging down below that is a 100 to 400 millimeter zoom lens. And there are some benefits to zoom lens. I prefer zoom lenses because they allow you flexibility. They give you a range of focal lengths, and you can achieve a wide variety of compositions by using a zoom. Now, I tried renting a 800 millimeter Canon lens. It came out this last year with two new lenses, a 600 and an 800 millimeter prime. Very inexpensive. One of them I think is $699, the other one's $899. So I rented the 800 millimeter. And while it was a good lens, it took good photographs, it really limited me if I was using it to walk around with. If I came upon something that was close, I just couldn't get the photographs. If something was far away, yes, I could get a good photograph. But you do limit yourself when you have those big lenses on. Fortunately, the new 600 and 800 millimeter lenses are quite light. They're kind of long, but they are very light, and you can walk around with them very easily. But the 600s, which are kind of like the holy grail for a bird photographer, it's not the kind of lens you're going to want to lug around with, or the kind you're going to want to hand hold. Now, there are a lot of popular zoom lenses that you can get fairly reasonably. Sigma makes a 150 to 600 that ranges between $900 and $1,000. Tamron makes a 150 to 600, which is about $1,200 or $1,300. And those I see often as I'm walking around. There'll be photographers that have those types of lens on. Nikon even makes a 200 to 500, which I believe runs around $1,500. The Canon that you see hanging there, the 100 to 400 brand new was $21.99. But now that they have come out with the mirrorless zoom, which is 100 to 500, you can probably get a pretty good deal on a used one. So prime versus zoom, it's personal preference, but there's cost, quality of lens, and the usability. I find the usability is for me was really a big issue. Okay, extenders. A lot of bird photographers use extenders. When I had my 5D Mark IV and I was carrying around my 100 to 400 millimeter lens, I had the extender on almost all the time because it would give me additional reach, but it still only got me out to 560 millimeters. So if you have a 1.4 extender, which is generally more popular, I think you get a 40% increase. And if you have a 2 times, you're going to double. So if you have a 400 millimeter lens, you're going to get it 800 millimeters. But one thing people oftentimes forget is they're not compatible with all lenses. You have to have a specific lens. So if you're going to think about getting an extender, I would urge you to do your research so you know that the lens you're going to purchase will work with an extender. I found personally that they do slow down the autofocus, just not nearly as quick as the naked lens by itself. Some say that the image quality suffers. I really haven't found that to be true. At least with my Canon extenders, I've found I have 1.4 that I use with my 100 to 500. I try not to use it too much because it really brings you out there, and I find it just not as fast as just using the 100 to 500 by itself. And the quality is very good. I don't think I lose too much quality with that extender, but there will be a lot of photographers that will say that you lose quality. I haven't really found that to be an issue. They do change your aperture, your f-stop. So a 100 to 400 would go from f4.5 to 5.6. And if you add the extender, now you're at 6.3 to f8. On my Canon 100 to 500, it now goes from the standard 4.5 to 7.1, and you're at f8 to f10. And one of the downsides that I really don't like about that lens is I have to have it out at 300 millimeters in order to get the extender on, where the other lens, the 100 to 400, I could put the extender on and I could still open it and close it and get it down into a short length and without having to take the extender off. So it's a bit of an inconvenience, but it still takes great pictures, and you'll see one or two later. Less light to the sensor, so you have to use a higher ISO if you want to get your shutter speed up. Equipment, tripods, very important. On the left, you'll see just a standard, inexpensive travel tripod I used for years. Probably $125, $130. And then on the right, I have an Enduro. It will probably go up, I think it's 7 feet. It's pretty tall. It's carbon fiber, pretty heavy duty, and it will really handle a lot of weight. I think 35 or 40 pounds without any problem. Now, there's 2 types of heads. One is primarily used for wildlife. On the left there, you can see the ball head, which is pretty much a standard ball head that you use with a travel tripod or any other tripod. This one is just very large because it's on that very large tripod, and they're not cheap. The ball head was over $200, and the tripod was $750 or $775, as I remember. But I have to tell you, it was worth every penny. I use that tripod all the time. And while I wouldn't want to go on a 10-mile hike with it, I can do 2 or 3 miles without too much trouble. Now, the gimbal head on the right allows you to move in all sorts of directions, where if you were to try that with the ball head on the left, the camera would be flopping all over the place, and you're going to have some bad results. But the gimbal heads really allow you to move, but they take some practice to get used to. Now, I'll tell you interesting story about gimbal heads. A lot of photographers will go out and buy a Wemberley head, which is probably $500 for the top part of that thing. But you really don't have to spend that kind of money. The one I have on there cost me $60. I got it at Amazon, and when I got it, it didn't work. So I went to YouTube, my favorite source for learning how to do things, and I found a guy that had bought the same exact gimbal head. And he found he couldn't use his either. It just wouldn't rotate. It wouldn't do what it was supposed to do. But he showed how to take it apart and clean it up, which I did. Used a different type of grease, and it works just as smooth as any other head you can imagine. So for the few times that I use it, there really isn't any sense in going out and spend a ton of money, unless you're really going to get into it and use it all the time. But you can get a pretty nice gimbal head for a lot less money than you might think. And this is an example of it. A beanbag. Oftentimes you can get some really good photographs of birds and wildlife shooting from your car. It's really a good place. It's kind of like a blind. The birds aren't scared of you if you're in the car, and a beanbag like this is a nice place to rest the camera. You don't have to hold it up, and you risk shaking if you're doing that. And here you can just rest it, and you'll have a pretty solid foundation to take your photos from. This was a small one. They come empty, but you can buy these little plastic beads that go in there, and they're very, very light and easy to walk around with. Clothing. If you're really into it, you can get into camouflage gear. I try to just wear muted colors, grays and tans, greens, things like that. When you're out walking around, I try not to wear reds and blues and yellows if I'm going to shoot birds and wildlife. Photo blinds, a lot of photographers will get into it if they're really serious about getting bird photos and they don't mind sitting in that little tent for hours on end. And you can buy these fairly reasonably. And there are also places where you can spend time in a permanent blind. But this gives you an option to take it out somewhere and set it up. You really need to remember to dress for the weather, both your camera, protect it, and your protection. About 2 years ago, I guess it was, I went to outside of Lodi. I think, Bill, you went probably the same year, a week or two before I did, and we talked about it a bit. The second day I was there, it poured, just absolutely poured. But I was able to get these photographs because I had pretty good rain gear on. So don't forget, if you're gonna have the chance of getting some bad weather, make sure you're protected and your gear is protected. Okay, here's one of the most important ones, I think. You have to understand how to use your camera. And I don't think that I really spent the time learning my camera in the past as I have recently. Since I got this new camera, which does so many more things, I've taken the time to learn more about it, to understand how it works and how to set it up. And there are all sorts of different ways that you can set it up. You have to choose the various focus points that you want, and I'll show you examples on the next slide. You have to figure out what shutter speed, aperture, your ISO, and auto ISO in a changing environment. Now, I mentioned earlier that I happen to like using auto ISO, and I use it probably 95% of the time when I'm shooting birds. And the reason is, I never know where or which direction or what sort of background I'm going to have when I'm shooting birds. And so if I set the ISO to 100 or 1,000, it may not be bright enough for me to get the bird if it goes into a darker area. So I find that auto ISO works really well. And a lot of bird photographers are doing this now, at least the ones that I've been following and reading about. auto ISO is really becoming popular. But with auto ISO, you can also change your exposure by using exposure compensation. And the reason you want to do that is, for instance, if you're going to be out walking around and you realize I'm going to be shooting white egrets and it's fairly bright out, you're going to overexpose the photograph very easily. However, if you crank in some negative exposure compensation, you can get the egrets and get all their feather detail without blowing out and having too much white in it. And on the other hand, you can bump it up if you have a dark bird and you want to increase the sensitivity. So exposure compensation is something that I use fairly often, especially with white birds. Let me see where I'm at here. Yep. Is anybody still there?
Yep.
I don't know why I can't move now. So maybe I should stop the share and try and get it going again. I can't advance to the next. Oh, there we go. Okay. Focus points, eye autofocus, people or animal. One thing you have to remember, and I have forgotten it more times than I care to tell you, is on my camera, it has eye detect autofocus. And you have to remember, if you're going to go out and photograph birds or animals, to switch it to animal. Otherwise, you'll find, why isn't this thing focusing the way it usually does? And it's because I'm not in the right mode. Now in Canon, and I'm pretty sure all the other cameras have similar focus points, there are times that each becomes the right one to use. For instance, on the left there, you have face and eye auto detect, and you'll want to use that if you're just going to focus on the bird's eye. However, if a bird is flying around and lands in a tree with a lot of branches, you're going to want to switch that focus point to a single spot. And the first one is the one that's outlined there is the small one, and then there's a larger one. And I use those if a bird flies into a tree, for instance, and I need to pick him out of the branches. I want to make sure I focus only on him and that the camera doesn't grab the branches right next to him. So I can switch directly to one of those focus points. And I have my camera set up now so that I can do everything with one hand without ever taking my eye off the viewfinder. And I can tell you a little bit more about that later. The one I use more often than not when I'm trying to get birds in flight is the expanded autofocus points. That's the one sort of in the middle. I like the one with the 8 dots on the outside of the focus point. That's the one I particularly like, and I rarely use the others. And the last ones on the right are the zone autofocus, large vertical. Those are good if you have a bunch of birds in flight and you have open sky and you want to just grab focus on one of them. That'll work very well. I still prefer to use the expanded autofocus points. Metering. Most of the time, I use evaluative metering. I think Nikon calls it matrix. And occasionally we'll use spot metering. And I found that in my experience and what I've read from others is that spot metering is really good for shooting a white bird when it has a dark background. So here's a swan sleeping. I think I had this in a competition recently. And there's a dark background. Now, if I had taken this in evaluative mode, everything would have been much brighter in the background and it made it a little more difficult to process and get this look. Plus, the bird is exposed properly. You can actually see all the feathers. And so spot metering in a situation like this works and works well. But most of the time, I find myself in evaluative mode. Okay, I don't know how many of you have eye auto detect focusing on your cameras. I know Sony has it. I think Nikon has it now, and my Canon has it. And it really is a game changer. And this is where gear, I think, becomes extremely important. It makes it a lot easier to compose a photograph and to catch birds in flight. So what I have here is a 2-minute video. Now, when I press play, I don't know if you're going to hear the guy's voice. And if I don't, I'll just chime in here and tell you what's going on. But is there a number of you that don't have eye auto tracking? I can't see you. So if you'll just let me know.
I do not have it.
Okay, well, now you'll get a chance to see how this works. And this guy did a really good demonstration on this very rare bird, as you can see, that he captured here. I think it's called a clip bird. I'm not sure why, but in any event, I'm going to start this. If it doesn't go, I will narrate it myself, but we'll see. This came from a photographer, a bird photographer. It's called Whistling Wings Photography. I took this out of one of his videos because it really does illustrate how eye auto tracking works.
On the bird's head.
Okay.
Now, you can move that autofocus point around to help compose your shot, especially if it was a perch bird. For a flying bird, it would be in the center, and you have that center autofocus point as your reference. And it was your job, like I said, my job to keep that autofocus point on the bird, preferably on the head or on the breast of the bird, and get my sharp images that way. And of course, if you move, that autofocus point moves with you and off the bird. And so it gets focused on the bird when it's on the bird. All pretty obvious. That's what you had to do. Now, with eye detect with tracking, fundamentally different situation. Here we go. Boom, right to the eye of the bird. And now, when you move, the autofocus point obviously moves with the bird's eye, no matter where it goes in the frame. So, how does this fundamentally change what I do? Well, it's simple. Before, you had to keep the autofocus point on the bird's head or breast or whatever you were trying to keep in focus. Now, the way I look at it, you get the bird's eye, you get lock on with the eye detect with tracking, and now it's not about whether I have focus or not. It's about actually composing the bird in the frame and pretty much ignoring the autofocus point. Before, the autofocus point, when you have just the center autofocus point, static like that, was your frame of reference. Now it's the bird's composition in the frame. When you're doing something like birds with eye detect with tracking, you now I pretty much ignore the autofocus point and just put the bird in the frame where I want it. And
Let me back up there. So it just makes it a lot easier to compose a photograph when you have eye detect autofocus. I'm going to move forward. I don't know if I'm
on the bird's head.
okay. I'll just explain a little bit because I got some background noise there. It makes it a lot easier to compose a photograph of a bird or an animal with the animal eye auto detect, because you can, like you said, move the camera around and the focus point will just remain on there. Now, it also makes it a lot easier when you're trying to get a bird in flight. Am I giving feedback or is that something else?
A little bit of feedback.
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from.
Everybody check your background noise.
Okay, I'll try it again. Anyway, to focus on a bird in flight, before, if you didn't have it, you had to keep that focus point on the bird. And while you can get good at it with your panning skills, it's a lot more difficult Now with this eye detect, you don't have to be right spot on because the bird will remain in focus even though you may be a little bit ahead of the bird or a little bit behind the bird will stay in focus as long as it's within that frame. So it makes it a lot easier, and I find that I'm getting huge percentage more keepers than I was before. Okay, how are we timed? Do you want to take a 5 or 10 minute break? How are we doing?
I could use a quick one.
All right, did we do 45 yet? I got more. Want to take a quick break, Bill?
Yeah, let's take 5 minutes and
Yeah. All right, I'll get started here. Fieldcraft, practice, patience, and perseverance. That's really what it boils down to is practice, practice, practice. You have to be patient. One thing I like to do in the early morning when I get out at sunrise, I'll go out to, and over here, it's Ellis Creek most of the time, or even down in the Petaluma Turning Basin. I've been known to bring a sand chair, one of those low chairs, and I'd sit it right on the edge of the pond and just sit there and wait and wait and wait until I can get the right photo. And I don't know why that's happening.
I think if everybody mutes, it helps.
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. Before you go out, it's nice to get some information, research where you're going to go. There's a number of wildlife refuge around here that's not too far away. Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge has a great website. You can go there and it'll tell you the type of birds and species of animals you're going to find there. It'll tell you what time of year they're going to be there. It's just a wealth of information if you're going to shoot wildlife and you want to go out to one of these refuges. The Audubon Society, of course, has a ton of information. The Birding Association, local birding clubs. A lot of it is word of mouth. And I have a couple of photos, or at least one that I got by word of mouth. And bird finding guides and apps. And it doesn't hurt to study the birds that you're going to photograph. Know where they're going to be, when they're going to be there, and some of their habits. I was photographing out at Ellis Creek a while back with another photographer. We're both standing there and I told him, I said, watch this guy, he's going to take off any second now. And it was because I've been watching them and noticed that every time just before they fly, they start bobbing their heads. And sure enough, we both focused on the birds and off they went. And I would have never known that had I not been paying attention and watching. So you learn those types of things as you go along. These are a few of the apps, just examples. The one on the left, the Merlin Bird ID, is my favorite one for a variety of reasons. The other one, Birding Hotspots, and you can see some of the areas in our area where there's birds to be found. And then there's another app you can get more than 800 birds and you can identify birds. What I like about the Merlin app is that you can open it up. It'll ask you a number of questions. Where are you? Your current location. And then it'll give you a diagram of various size birds. And I think there's like 5 or 6 sizes. And you choose what size bird, you click on that, and then it'll ask you what color. And then it'll ask you, what were they doing? Were they in the trees? Were they waiting? So it asks you a number of questions. And then if you click enter, it'll come up with a number of possibilities about what your bird is. And it's really, well, not always easy because sometimes very difficult to tell different species. But for the most part, you can tell what that bird is very easily. Another thing, and one that I've done for this particular presentation, is the photo ID. If you have a photograph of a bird, but you don't know what it is, put it up on the computer, take the app, hit the photo ID button. It'll allow you to take a photograph of the bird that's on your computer screen, and it'll tell you what it is or give you a number of choices. So it's really an excellent app to have and very easy to use. Okay, where and when do I find wildlife? Well, when you least expect it, you might just find something like this. Nancy and I were driving up to Hurricane Ridge up in Washington a month or two ago. And up comes this bear right up alongside the road. And I had my zoom lens right there and I was able to get it. So you just never know when you're going to miss an opportunity. And Tony will tell you that I missed a really good opportunity a few days ago when it came to trying to catch osprey. We went out to dinner and I didn't bring my camera or my long lens. And then we took a little drive to do some exploring and we found 15 osprey flying around this jetty. Could have kicked myself for not having my camera. So you never know when you're going to find them. One way to do some research is know that they have flyways. These are the main migratory bird flyways. Obviously, we're in the Pacific flyway. And I'll go over 3 of the various birds that you can find. The sandhill cranes in the Central Valley, and I think some of us have been down to Lodi on a field trip a couple of years ago, I think it was. And the sandhill cranes are there from generally October to December. And that's a lot of fun to go find them. And there's wildlife refuges there. And if you talk to people, you can generally find where they're going to be. Another example is snow geese. These were taken at the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge up in Willows. It has a driving tour, and then there's a number of spots that they allow you to stop and get out of the car. But for the most part, you stay on this driving route. But you can get some good photographs right from your car. And so here they have the snow geese, and they're there between November and December. So another photograph, this is what you'll see when they're migrating, these huge populations of birds, and they'll take off, and it's quite a sight to see. Tundra swans at the Klamath National Wildlife Refuge, November to March. I happened to have gone on a workshop, it was an eagle workshop up to Klamath National Wildlife Refuge, but they have all kinds of other birds there also. So I was able to get photos of tundra swans. Now, if you see something like this, you may want to stop somewhere and pull over and find out what they're taking pictures of. Because obviously they all have telephotos on, and I don't think they're doing street photography. So if you see something like this, you might want to stop and pull over because you may see something like this. Now, when I saw a bunch of photographers on the side of the road, and it wasn't those 3 in the previous slide, I was out at Point Reyes National Seashore, and I was going out where the elk are and towards the very end to that ranch. And I saw 4 or 5 photographers with big tripods and big lenses and pointed up at this rock cliff. So I pulled over and I got out and walked up, and they pointed out where these owls were. So I would have never, ever seen these owls just driving by, because you can see how well they blend into the rocks. Your backyard, or your neighbor's yard in this case, you know, people have feeders. You can get some pretty good photographs at feeders. The zoo or the game park. Monkey on the left I got thanks to the club at the what do you call the Safari West. That was a wonderful place to get photographs. The dragonfly at local park, that was Howarth Park. And then I had a fella tell me about these turkeys, these wild turkeys that were in a Katati neighborhood, and they always were at the same place. So I went out there early one morning, and it was really something to see, because, you know, you'd see turkeys walking around the residential streets occasionally, but you don't see them up in the trees. I hadn't seen them up in the trees before. So it was quite a treat. And then to see them eventually fly down was pretty exciting. So word of mouth can be really good too. Regional parks, there's a couple of whitetail kites fighting over breakfast. You have your national parks where you can get buffalo and all kinds of other various size animals. Wildlife Refuge, that particular eagle shot I got at Klamath Falls National Wildlife Refuge on that workshop I went to. And animal rescue, I remembered this at the last minute today. I forgot, the club, we went up there. Here's just a couple of the pictures that I took that day. That was a great trip. And if you go to Pete's Coffee in Cotati and you have your camera, you might just get some bird photos. You just never know. I try and carry a camera with me all the time, and you can get some pretty interesting shots. I kind of like this character here. Another way to get it is I went on this safari. It was called, as you can see, Discovery Marine Safaris. And it left from Campbell River, British Columbia, over on Vancouver Island. And you take the boat for a 2-hour trip over to the mainland. And it takes you to a wildlife sanctuary run by the Hamalco First Nations. And what they did there was they put you in a small minibus and they took you out to various locations where you would see bears. And it was very interesting. I thought they handled it extremely well. The first stop, which is where these photographs were taken, they had a stand which was raised. You had to climb some steps to get up into this big platform that was fenced in. And so you could look down on these various bears. And we were very, very close. I mean, there was a mom and the little one that must have been less than 10 feet from us. And the locals that were running the tour, once we got to the mainland there, all stood around the platform with bear spray and protected all of us that were on this trip. And I think there was a maximum of 15 or 20, and it was extremely well done. It's a 2-hour boat ride over to the mainland. They give you lunch. On the way back, we happened to see a whale. I was able to get some whale photos. So it's a great way to do something different to get out. It's not inexpensive. I think I just checked today to see what the current rates are, and it's $530 per person. It's an all-day trip. And Nance and I just really had a great time. Okay, checklist on arrival, and I've learned these the hard way. Check the camera battery. That's not one I've had a problem with. Check the autofocus mode. I mentioned earlier, people versus animal. I've a few times gone out and couldn't get my camera to focus the way it normally would, and I found out I was in people mode from photographing my grandkids the day before. So make sure you're in the right mode. Make sure you're in servo mode or continuous focus mode. Make sure your autofocus switch on the lens is on. Make sure your image stabilization switch is on. Make sure you have the right speed, ISO, and aperture that you want to shoot at, and then take a test shot. Okay, how to photograph a bird. Focus on his eye. That's what the main thing you want to get in a bird photography is a bird's eye. If the bird is going away from you, it's really not a photo that you really want to keep. Frame the image the way you want to, and then like you saw in the video, if you have the eye detect autofocus, it makes it very easy to put the bird in the frame. Otherwise, you have to move your joystick to try and get the focus point where you want it. Set the composition the way you like. Check your background. Pay attention to the details. Make sure the eye is in focus. You're using the right aperture. If you want to try and get the entire bird in focus, you might want to try being at f8 or above, and look for the background. And if you have a histogram in your viewfinder, take a quick glance at that and see if your lighting is right. Okay, birds in flight. This is my favorite part of bird photography. This is what's really challenging. It's a lot of fun. And it's very rewarding when you can get some good bird in flight photographs. If you remember, I had a a seagull a while back in a competition that did pretty well. And I got him taking off. It was probably, I think I took it on the same night I took this photograph. But I was using the electronic shutter, which gives you 20 frames a second, and you can just get all kinds of options for photographs to choose from. So birds in flight, high shutter speed, 1/2500th of a second. I really try to keep it above 1,000 if I can. You know, if you go early in the morning and it's not light, I'll have to drop it to 500 or 600, 840, something like that. And if it's early in the morning like that, that's one time that I will not use auto ISO. I'll actually set the ISO to something like 2000, and it'll give me a more realistic view of what the picture should be. Because oftentimes if you use auto ISO and it's too dark, it's just going to make the picture too bright, and it's going to bump up your ISO where you can have so much noise, it may be difficult to get rid of it. Here's an osprey carrying a lamprey eel. Took this recently. Here's another seagull just as he's taking off and starting to get into horizontal flight. And again, it's got some pretty good shutter speed going there. Here's a juvenile bald eagle banking into a turn carrying what's left of his breakfast. So it's pretty rewarding when you can get these kind of bird in flight images. And then when you can get a bird coming right at you, I always find that's pretty exciting because oftentimes they'll veer away from you and it's not easy to get a bird coming right at you. But this pelican out of Bodega decided it wanted to have its picture taken. And then this one, I think the last example of the bird in flight is down by the Golden Gate Bridge. I was down there recently with Tony. We were walking around and I saw this hawk up on this power pole and decided to wait. And I didn't have to wait very long, but fortunately had my shutter speed up high and I was able to catch him in flight. Okay, so to reiterate a little bit, you want to stop the movement unless it's something that you're doing for a creative reason, such as having motion in the wings. If you want to stop the motion, the higher the shutter speed, the better. You want to use a little bit wider depth of field if you want to get the whole bird in focus. Looking sharp, f8 generally works well. Don't be afraid to push your ISO up to 2000, 3200, and I have some examples here of a photo at 12,800, and you'd be surprised the quality that you can get. And don't hesitate to take the photograph because you're not going to have another chance. I mean, these birds just fly by once, basically, if it's what you're looking for. So take the shot. If you miss it, you miss it. But if you might get lucky and get it. And once the bird flies by, you might as well just stop pressing the trigger because you want to get the eye into the picture. Okay, processing. Primarily, these are the apps that I'll use for processing. Most of the time, it's Lightroom. Oftentimes, I'll do Topaz Denoise. I think it's a fabulous program, one of the best, I think. Topaz Sharpen AI has saved some photographs for me that weren't savable, but that when you use Topaz Sharpen, you can actually come up with a very nice image. I'll use Aurora HDR occasionally, and I'll show you some examples of this coming up. Photoshop, I'll use that primarily for removing objects from photographs. If there's stuff in the water around a bird, if a bird is swimming and I want to get it out of the photograph and I'm not going to enter it into competition, I will remove it. And then gigapixel, if you have to crop it really a lot and you want to print perhaps the photo, you might want to put it into gigapixel to up-res the photograph. Now, here's a juvenile bald eagle, and I warmed up the one on the right just to make it look a little different, but this was taken at 12,800 ISO at 1/1600. And while it might be a little small on your screen, I'm on a fairly good sized screen here. You can see there's a ton of noise on the left, but Topaz did a really good job just using the automatic settings of getting rid of the noise. And it actually makes the photograph worth saving. Here's another example of denoise. Obviously, that's me and my grandson, but you can see it was taken at, I believe this one was 12,800 also. Yes, it was. And this was indoors in the evening at one of the kids' birthday parties recently. And just using the automatic settings, you come up with a pretty clear photograph. Aurora HDR, I don't use it all the time, but occasionally I will. And here's an example. This is, I believe, a black phoebe or some such bird. And like I said, I'm not an expert, but I think that's what this is. And the original is on the left, and I ran it through Aurora HDR, the 2019. When I do that, I will only use the original photo that comes out of Aurora. I won't use any of the other settings or templates that come with it. I just take the original and I'll bring it back into Lightroom and try and finish it up. But you can see it brings out a lot of detail. It brings out detail in his feathers, in the white down on his belly, and you see more of his face, takes out the shadows. It really does a very nice job. Not for every photo, but oftentimes it can work very well. Here's another example. I believe this is a willet or a godwit, I don't recall, running down the beach. And on the left is the raw file that was edited, and then I put it into HDR, and you can see it brought out more detail in the feathers and lightened it up just a bit. So it can be quite beneficial. Sharpen AI is another one that I really like. I think it can be overdone, and I know I've overdone it myself sometimes, but I try and be careful. So here on the left is the original. And if you take a look at the one on the right, it brought out detail in his beak, and his eye is sharper. And then the feathers behind the eye and to the right there, it brings out a lot of detail. So Sharpen AI is really a wonderful program, and it gives you several choices. It gives you motion blur, an out of focus photograph, or whether or not it's too soft. I've only used motion blur and out of focus. I haven't found too soft to be of any use to me. So if you don't have Topaz Sharpen AI, it's really a wonderful program. You might give it a try. Okay, Gigapixel. Now, Gigapixel is an up-res thing where you can double the size, or 4 times or 6 times the size of your image. So what I did here was I wanted to make the photo larger because I really just wanted the head of the bird. And you can see there's a fair amount of noise there. Well, Gigapixel will sharpen the photo and get rid of some noise, but it does a lot of sharpening. If you look at the eyes, you can see they're sharper. The feathers, his beak is sharper. And then you can take it out of Gigapixel after you've up-resed it to the size that you want, if you're going to print it, for instance. And I put it into denoise. And here you can see the original. It came out of Gigapixel up on the top left. And then I happened to choose the standard on the right. And you can see how well it got rid of the noise. But it did keep it quite sharp, and it made it a very usable photograph. And the next one, I believe, is the final. So after I took it out of those programs, this is what I ended up with. And I happened to use it as a profile photo on my Facebook page for a little while. So these programs are really excellent. Ethics and etiquette. Don't trespass. If you don't own the property, don't go there unless you have permission. And really the guiding principle is place the welfare and the safety of the wildlife and their habitats above all else, and avoid disturbing them in any way. Try and keep your distance, get your photographs, don't bother them. I give you an example of something recently that happened I got about a year ago. I was out at Jenner taking photographs of pelicans that were at the mouth of the river. And you know, the seals are always over there on the beach right by the mouth. Well, a woman and her husband, they both had kayaks, were down on the river at the mouth. And the woman paddled over to the beach, got out of her kayak and started chasing the seals away. And I just wanted to, if I had a gun, I probably would have shot her. But it was really disturbing to see that. So don't do that sort of behavior. Okay, resources, the Audubon Society. These places all have websites you can go to. North American Nature Photographers Association, American Bird Conservancy, Birding Association. Lots of great resources here for you to find out about birds, locations, all sorts of things. Facebook groups are good ones. The Cornell Lab, which is the bird ID finder that I talked to you about, the Audubon app. Other photographers are a great resource. I use YouTube and Instagram a lot, mostly YouTube. There are some wonderful bird photographers and nature photographers on YouTube. Mark Smith is one, my favorite. He does it a little differently. He narrates when he goes out to shoot birds, and he tells the story of what he's seeing and doing, and he mixes it with video and stills. And his photographs are simply amazing. He shoots, I think, with a Sony A1 now, and has all the big lenses. But he leads workshops on ospreys. He has an osprey workshop he does, and he does an eagle workshop. So there's all sorts of photographers out there that you can follow and learn from. And YouTube, for me, is a great resource. And then I have a book called Birds of California, which has been helpful. You can look up, it's very easy to find the various birds. Doesn't give you quite as much information as you might like, so I'll oftentimes go to Google and then follow up there after I've determined if I have the right bird or not. The end. So you're probably tired of me talking and showing you photographs, but I got this one here for Tony because it's his favorite critter. So I will stop the share unless there's something that you wanted to see again. No? Okay, I'll see if I can get out of this.
I don't know. You could keep it right there. It's awfully cute.
Yeah,
It is.
Yeah.
yeah. I don't have a cursor for some reason. I don't know. How do I
That
do
was a tremendous presentation.
Yeah,
it was great.
Yeah,
Mike.
good.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well,
Thank you.
thanks. If you have any questions, I'd like to see you because I want to show you something on my camera. Mouse. How do I get to the mouse here?
Yeah, very well covered, by the way. It did covered a lot of territory, and it really gave a lot of ideas both for the beginner and a few good ideas for us with a little more experience too.
Well, good.
That's great.
I had a lot of fun doing it, but I think I'm getting there. Hold on.
Yep, you're there.
Great.
Hey, I found you.
Mike, I
Yeah.
had a question about a picture that you posted of a bird on your trip to Oregon. It looked like a puffin. And I just wondered if you knew,
I
was
think
it
it was
really a puffin or not?
they have puffins up there in Bandon, and they also have, and I haven't had a chance to look it up yet, something called auklets, and I think that's what that one was.
Oh,
The
okay.
colorful face. They were kind of
Yes.
far out in the ocean, but I was able to get that. And it was an interesting bird because it's not something I see all the time. So
Yeah,
when I come back from a trip and I get an opportunity to shoot osprey or eagles or something like the auklet, it just makes wanting to go to Ellis Creek less desirable because I know I'm just going to see ducks and egrets. And you really do get spoiled when you find other wildlife.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk one thing I don't think I really covered. I use back button autofocus. I don't
yeah.
know how many of you do. If you don't, you really should probably try it because it's a great way. And on my camera, I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, Anyway, there's two buttons that I use. I use two back button autofocus. One that is a primary focus that I just use for standard focusing on a person or an object if I'm doing a landscape. And then the other button, which I have set up as the star button on the back of a Canon. And it's the same if you have a 5D Mark IV or any of those other ones. They have AF on, which I use for my standard focusing. And then the star button I have set up as my eye auto tracking. So I just rest my thumb on the main autofocus, but I can also just rock my thumb over and push down on the eye auto tracking. So once I have the bird, at least in the frame, I click the other button and it automatically grabs his eye. And it just makes it so much easier to do. So the new cameras have this ability, and it's a great way to set up your camera. So if I'm holding my camera in my right hand, I've also changed, I've set it up so, you know, in the front of the camera, at least on the Canon, and perhaps you have it on Nikon and Sony, on the front, at least on mine, there's a depth of field preview button. And it's right by my finger here that I'm moving. And I can change my focus spots just by pushing that button as I'm looking through the viewfinder, and it'll change from single point autofocus to eye auto tracking. It does it all automatically. Just boom, just right here. I never have to move. So it makes very simple. Another thing on these new cameras on the mirrorless, you can set up your screen. I don't know. Yeah, where is it? Yeah. You know, the flippy screen on the back here. You can set that so you can move your thumb over the screen and use it instead of a joystick.
Wow.
So the joystick is nice, but you know, you kind of have to click it over to the left and click it over to the right. Where if you use the touch screen, you can set it up to only be sensitive at a certain portion of the screen. So I use the upper right of the screen, and I can move my thumb around and it automatically moves the focus point. So it makes it a lot easier. Not that I'm shooting birds because I use the eye auto tracking, but if I want to get something in focus at a certain place and I don't want to use the joystick, I just use the back of the touch screen. Makes it really easy to do.
Mike,
Yeah.
are you using only mirrorless lenses, or do you use any of your old Canon lenses with an?
Yeah, I do. I have the adapter and they work flawlessly.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely flawlessly. I used the 100 to 400 was my favorite lens, and I used the adapter with that, got great results. And then I've since upgraded to the 100 to 500.
How much light do you lose?
With what?
With the extender or with the adapter?
You don't lose any with the adapter.
Really?
No, you don't lose any. It's just like, well, it's just like having a native lens on there. The Canon did a wonderful job. So if you're considering getting one of the mirrorless cameras, the adapter is a great way to go. I still have the EF wide angle lens that I use on it.
No.
It works flawlessly. I just did buy the new Nifty 50. It's like $199. Takes great photographs. It's my new walk around lens. And let's see, do I have any other ones? Oh, I have a Sigma 50 millimeter art lens. It's a 1.4, and I use the adapter with that one too. And my 24 to 105 is the RF mirrorless lens. So about half of my lenses are the old type, but you know, they're worth a lot of money and they take good photographs. So
yeah, I was checking the prices and the camera is pricey enough, but then when you look at the lenses, oy vey.
yeah, the lenses are very pricey, but if you have a set of lenses, just get the adapter. They'll work wonderfully. You won't notice any difference at all.
Okay, that could be a game changer.
I just checked on Nikon. They do have a eye detection system on their Z6 and Z7, and they have an adapter, you know, old lenses to mirrorless for like $250.
Yeah,
And
Canon,
that's with, 30 seconds of search on B&H. So
Yeah, a lot of those will come with the adapter free, depending. I've seen a lot of deals on that. And to answer Terry on a Nikon, what they did is they actually made where the mount itself is larger in the Z than it is in the standard Nikon cameras. And that's where the adapter works, so it collects a little more light and allows him to do
Oh,
things with the
okay.
lenses like that. Yeah,
That explains
but
that.
that's the Nikon Z anyway. I'm not familiar with other ones.
I imagine it's the same with the Canon.
the Canon comes with you can get 3 different adapters. They have the cheap adapter, which is $99, and it works perfectly well. You don't need anything else but the cheapest one. Then you have the option to go to the second level, which has an adjustment ring on it, so you can set up your ISO or exposure compensation. You can dial that ring to anything, you can program it to anything you want.
Oh, really?
And that's $199, I believe. I have that one. I don't use it very much, but I have it. And then the most expensive one is like $399 or $329, and that one has a drop-in filter. So you can
I'm
actually.
sorry, I didn't catch that. There was noise behind you.
The highest end one, the most expensive adapter they have, has a drop-in filter, and you can buy ND filters that actually fit into the adapter.
Oh,
You don't have to screw it onto your lens. So that's what Canon has as their 3 adapters. But
Cool,
yeah,
thank
don't
you.
hesitate to buy the camera, because you'll be able to use your lenses.
that makes a difference.
Big difference. Yeah, very big.
Huge. Yeah, one of those lenses, or several of those lenses, were almost as expensive as the camera, I noticed.
Yeah, well, my 100 to 500 was $26.99, and I had to wait 2 months for it.
Yeah.
They're not cheap,
No.
But I love it, and it was worth it to me. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you for that information.
any other questions that I can help?
Can you talk again about the crop sensor versus full frame, or using them together? I wasn't sure what camera. Are you talking about using a full frame camera and setting it to crop sensor, or?
Yeah, you can do that. Well, they're 2 separate cameras, basically. Your less expensive
Yeah,
DSLR.
I have a full frame camera.
Okay.
So what I'm curious about is using any lens, can I just set it to crop sensor and get an extension in terms of the, how far out that telephoto lens would go?
Well, I don't know on your camera particularly, but on mine I can. So
Okay.
I can set mine, and I'm going to go to the menu and see exactly what it says. But it gives me the option of going to various aspect ratios. And so I have it set to full frame, which is your standard full frame. But I also can go to crop mode, which is on the Canon 1.6. And then I can go to 1.1, 4.3, and I can set it up to be 16.9, the LED screen size.
Mhm.
But the crop
Nikon,
sensor mode,
yeah.
most of the time you'd use your crop sensor to get closer. The trouble is you lose megapixels that way.
Mhm.
If you're close enough and you want to get really close, you can use that crop mode on a full frame. I've tried it a few times, never really been too satisfied. I don't know, others may have different experience, but for me, I just don't care to do that.
Okay, I was just curious if it would make my telephoto lens go farther.
Yeah, it would if you have a full frame.
If you're gonna lose resolution, then
Yeah,
Well,
worth it.
yeah, you'll lose a little resolution.
you're using Nikon, Tricia, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because what it'll do is like a lot of the 24 megapixel cameras will automatically convert it, but it'll be 12. And that's what I noticed with the, some of the newer cameras, it'll be 12, but the only way you can get like 24 megapixels is if you go up to the 45 megapixel camera. So it'd be like the Z7 instead of the Z6, or the 850 Nikon will automatically convert to 24 if you use DX lens.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
You have to check the stats and statistics on each one.
yeah, and it can make a big difference if you start cropping.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, anything else? All right, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed putting it together.
Wow, thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Mike. Great job.
Great. Really fun.
Yeah, fabulous
We've got
job.
some-
Learned so much.
Thank
Great
you.
job,
Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing more of your photos, Mike.
Yes.
I have a lot to work on.
Okay.
I have a couple of thousand to look through this weekend.
Sounds like you have fun too.
Yeah, I will. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.